Over a decade ago, Oda revealed the bad blood between Sakazuki and Dragon. For the most part, many in the community predicted that Dragon might have been a Navy soldier at some point. This was of course founded on the fact that Garp, his father, is a hero of the Navy. It therefore goes to say that a young Monkey D. Dragon must have been trained by Garp, in hopes that he joined the Navy. In this chapter, Oda just revealed that Dragon effectively joined the Navy, but he eventually quit the Navy for some unknown reason. It was probably during his time in the Navy that Dragon might have met Sakazuki and stole his girlfriend. After all, we already know that Dragon and Sakazuki are both 55 years old, and thus of the same generation. Dragon's reason for quitting the Navy might have been motivated by the Celestial Dragon's disregard for human lives. If you guys want to see Dragon flee with Sakazuki's girlfriend, please let us know in the comments section. This chapter of One Piece began 8 years after the God Valley incident. Kuma, now 17, had become the village pastor. I think Kuma followed in the footsteps of his father, Clap. If Kuma's house was a church, that must have meant that Clap too was a pastor. Kuma used his devil fruit power to extract the pain that the old were feeling, as long as they were minute injuries and sicknesses. This was done once a week. The residents, however, wanted Kuma to heal them on weekdays as well, but Ginny objected. She was the only one who knew what happened to the pain that Kuma extracted from the villagers. Similar to how Zoro took all of Luffy's pain during the Thriller Bark arc, Kuma would take in all of the pain he had extracted from the villagers. It turns out that if he did not do so, the pain would simply return to the persons from which it was extracted. This led to Kuma spending a huge chunk of the week bedridden. Kuma was willing to go through all of this to ensure that everyone was happy. I think here Oda clearly highlighted the total disconnect between the villagers' perception on what was happening and Kuma's perception on what was happening. If they knew of Kuma's weekly ordeal for their sake, they might not have been so demanding. The villagers could not help Kuma in any way, because they, despite being poor, were forced to pay the heavenly tribute. They were thus struggling to survive themselves. 5 years later, Ginny asked Kuma to marry her. Talk about a reverse proposal. Ginny's proposal was however rejected. Not because Kuma did not like her, but because Kuma did not want he and Ginny to go through the same ordeal as his parents, especially if they started a family and had a kid. Also, they were both fugitives and were still wanted, and if they had a kid, things would eventually become much more complicated for them, as they would lose their freedom. Kuma pulled up the newspaper, and the scoop talked about Monkey D. Dragon, the leader of a vigilante group that fanned the fuel of rebellion in many countries. What I found interesting about this part of the chapter was that it appeared that the vigilantes, especially Monkey D. Dragon, had been given a bounty. Whichever bounty this was, would therefore have been Dragon's first ever bounty. Kuma was inspired by Dragon's actions and hoped that one day he could travel the world and save others. This was the embodiment of his character, as Ivankov at one point even called his hands the hands of revolution. The two kids who attacked Kuma in the previous chapter came to visit Kuma and had a gift for Ginny, a basket full of fish. Depending on the translation that you read, the guy with hat was either referred to as Jayo Jayo or fishmonger. Jayo Jayo sounds kind of weird because it literally translates to fish in Japanese. I think that would be kind of lazy from Oda, unless it does have some sort of deeper meaning to it. Despite the change in rulership, the living conditions of the citizens actually worsened, as the new king imposed levies on the poor. The already terrible living conditions took a turn for the worse, as after 3 years, the king decided to split the kingdom into two. On one side of the kingdom, the good and wealthy tax-paying class lived, and on the other side, the old and poor lived. This new king seemed to be obsessed with being on the good graces of the celestial dragons by paying the heavenly tribute, even if it meant hurting a good proportion of the citizens. This new law was implemented so that the kingdom could prosper, so the king thought, because in his own words, if they could get rid of the old and poor people who could not pay their taxes, the kingdom was bound to prosper. In this light, he imposed a new law that gave the tax-paying class the ability to do anything that they wanted with the old and poor. This meant that the families of those who lived in the poor part of the Sorbet kingdom could now be enslaved. This king therefore enacted a law that legalized the slavery of his own citizens. Because of this new law, many of the poor were kidnapped. This of course angered Kuma, who tried to rescue them, and even attacked them with an Ursus shock, which was not as big as the one he used in Marineford, clearly hinting at Kuma not having as good of a mastery over his devil fruit as he has now. Kuma was however defeated and locked up in the dungeon. Ginny and the fishmongers ran amok and eventually got confronted by the soldiers. They too were defeated, and eventually found themselves locked up in the dungeon. Their stay there was however short-lived, as the king was later on disposed of by the freedom fighters. This part of the chapter was great, as it had been almost 12 years since Ivankov left, and finally, on his return, he and the freedom fighters not only saved their friends, but also freed the Sorbet kingdom from the oppressive rule of this new king. The actions of the freedom fighters indirectly affected the celestial dragons, as all of the nations that they helped to dispose of the leadership simply stopped paying the heavenly tribute. This, of course, did decrease the funds that the celestial dragons had available. Ivankov gave Kuma an open invitation to join them and help free the oppressed from their oppressors, and he gladly accepted. Initially, the two main pillars of the organization were Ivankov and Monkey D. Dragon. But, with the addition of Kuma to the freedom fighters, the group went through a name change and became called the Revolutionary Army. At this point in the story, Bello Betty had already joined the Revolutionary Army. Even though their vigilante group had had tremendous success, they still needed funds to provide the appropriate training for new recruits. Dragon seemed to be well versed in handling weapons. When questioned about how he learned how to use those weapons, Dragon replied that he once served in the Navy, but he quit because he did not find justice there. This statement is very important in the story, because it not only confirms a fan favorite theory, but it also highlights the different ideological views of the three different members of the Monkey D family. I believe this ideological differences merits a video on its own. If you guys want a video on that topic, please let me know in the comments section. It was probably during his time in the Navy that Dragon probably met a young Sakazuki, who seems to still harbor a grudge against Dragon for his betrayal. We have also seen that all members of the Monkey D family have fought a Navy admiral recently. Garp fought against Kyuzen, Luffy fought against Kizaru. Maybe Oda has been saving Dragon for this moment, as he is bound to fight Sakazuki at some point. The design of the Revolutionaries' ship is very different from their current ship. I do not know what the symbol on their ship's Jolly Roger represents. So, if you guys know what it does represent, let me know in the comments section. 8 years later, Kuma returned to the Sorbet Kingdom after a long period of absence, and the citizens were overjoyed to see him. Ginny was revealed to be the acting captain of the Eastern Revolutionary Army. Ginny was overjoyed because she was going to be meeting Kuma's division. This might have implied that Kuma was probably a captain of the Revolutionary Army in the past. If I were to guess, I would say he might have been the captain of the Southern Army, since it guaranteed that he would be able to visit the Sorbet Kingdom from time to time. The final panel of the chapter was a shocker, as news broke out in the Revolutionaries' headquarters on Baltigo that Ginny had been captured by an unexpected enemy. If we narrow down the list of suspects to a few, I think one of the most likely suspects had to be the Holy Knights, because they seem to be the defenders of the interests of the Celestial Dragons. This could also have been the work of CP0, since their agents do excel at covert operations. Given that Ginny was an army commander, she must have been well protected. This therefore meant that Ginny was either captured by force, where their army was attacked by an enemy that had overwhelming military might, forcing the entire East Army to concede defeat, or it was probably a covert operation. Ginny Cowles also have been defeated and captured by a single opponent who was far stronger than she was. I believe since Ginny seemed to be somewhat close to Bello Betty, the conclusion of this backstory will also explain how Bello Betty became the Revolutionaries' Eastern commander. I will like to end the chapter analysis with this thought of mine. Since the introduction of Kuma's backstory, we have seen him go through an unimaginable amount of pain. We have also seen Saturn's profound hatred for the Buccaneers. Saturn has also displayed abnormal regeneration and seems untouchable. What if Oda was setting up Kuma's final clash with Saturn to involve Kuma removing all of the pain he has been through all this while, and Saturn inadvertently coming in contact with the extracted pain, thus enabling Saturn to have a taste of his own medicine? That would be an interesting turn of events, right? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments section. Please be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you do not miss new content. I am your host Sean, and I will catch you on the next one.